Welcome to SpyCast, the official podcast of the International Spy Museum. I'm your host, Dr. Andrew Hammond, the museum's historian and curator. Every week, we explore some aspect of the past, present, or future of intelligence and espionage. If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving us a 5-star review so other listeners can find us. It really does make a difference. Coming up next on SpyCast.
When you start looking as I did, you do see these lines of continuity. Both Kermit Roosevelt and Edward Lansdale, of all people, who in many of their conscious attitudes were anti-imperial, anti-colonial, nonetheless sort of found themselves repeating some of the patterns of the past.
Well, thanks ever so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to speaking to you.
Thanks for having me on, Andrew. I appreciate it.
You bet. So the title of your book, The CIA, An Imperial History. So it's not really a genre that we've seen anything of recently. So in the book, you say that there's people that have written a history of the CIA. There's people that have written about American empire or the idea of an American empire, but no one's done both. So can you just tell us a little bit more about how you decided to put the two of them together and to write about it?
Yeah, for sure. It really occurred to me that the fields in which I operate, which are the history of American foreign relations on the one hand and intelligence history on the other, they weren't really sort of communicating as much as I thought they might. And it seemed to me there'd been some interesting work in the field of the history of American foreign relations recently, especially around the notion of America as empire, which could sort of throw some illuminating light on the history of American intelligence generally and the history of the CIA in particular. So that's kind of what I set out to do in this book, is use this new scholarship and its insights to kind of recontextualize the CIA within this larger, longer history of Western imperial intelligence and really kind of see where that led. I mean, I didn't want to get too hung up on the question of America as empire. I was being more sort of pragmatic than that. I just wanted to see, if you sort of adopted this kind of imperial lens, what would the CIA looked like then. And I think it did reveal some aspects of the history of the agency which people hadn't really noted and explored before.
And you open the book saying that there's an established narrative of American intelligence. Can you just tell our listeners what that narrative is?
Yes, it really suggests that for the most part, intelligence in the US has just been a sort of a byproduct of war. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. It's the Revolutionary War, the birthplace of the Republic. It was then that Washington turned to spies and so on, sort of down through American history, that you would get these wartime, the Civil War, and then both world wars in the 20th century. You would get this use of intelligence and covert action. But then after that, the US backed away from it because of a tradition of, dislike of secretive big government, and also the notion that spies often went together with empire, and this was what the US was rebelling against, and the US didn't see itself as an empire, and there's this long history of anti-imperialism within America. So, but I sort of tried to kind of break away from that a little bit and think about the CIA as a peacetime intelligence organization, and why the US needed a permanent civilian intelligence agency in the years after World War II. It seemed to me that was a different sort of paradigm was needed to approach this the CIA as this unique organization that wasn't actually accompanied by a hot war, if not a cold one.
So you mentioned these anti-imperialist impulses because these are connected to the formation of the country, right? As a revolt against the British Empire and, overweening British rule in North America. But then you say that's not the only ideological influence in the US. There's also uh, an imperial influence, whether it be in the wake of the Spanish American War in 1898, where all of a sudden it finds itself with the Philippines. But then there's also the connection with the British Empire, which is really the main strand that you kind of draw on in the book, where we look at some of the people that populate your book. So you're right. There's the quote, distinct imperial class of citizenry that consciously borrowed its values from the British Empire. So can you just talk a little bit more about that before we introduce some of the characters in the book?
Yes, despite this long history of anti-imperialism, going back to the very earliest days of the American Republic, that there have always been those advocating for American expansion as well, and I think that becomes a particularly important influence in the 1890s, around the time of the Spanish-American War, and going forward. There is this sort of distinct class of American citizens based in the Northeast, the products of often of New England prep schools and Ivy League universities, who see America as the heir of the British Empire and really want to sort of take up the imperial mantle in the world. And they're influenced by British Empire in quite a specific way as well, in that a lot of them, a lot of these New England prep schools that they attend, I think Groton is in rural Massachusetts is the kind of the best example, are modeled on British public schools. They read British imperial spy novels by authors like Rudyard Kipling and John Buchan. And this sort of shapes their worldview, and it leaves them wanting not just to sort of emulate the example of the British Empire in general, but also to sort of lead kind of imperial lives themselves. They want the sort of imperial adventures, and often, spy adventures that Kipling heroes like Kim, this boy spy in colonial India, have. So it's that those are big influences on them, and then even those, and there were also CIA officers who weren't sort of members of this class and actually were distinctly anti-imperialist, anti-colonial in their attitude. Even as they operated increasingly in the third world in the 1950s, they were doing so in former colonies of the British and French empires, especially, and they found there were just various ways in which that history sort of weighed on them, and they couldn't escape it. So even if they sort of didn't want to use imperial era colonial type sort of scripts for the missions that they'd been asked to perform, they found themselves doing so, even if they didn't particularly want to.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that they almost find themselves in imperial positions, sometimes almost despite themselves. They're living in white enclaves. They're uh, receiving people coming asking for favors and money and so forth. So there's this almost, I guess, performative aspect to the imperial part of American empire. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. I think especially during the 1950s, as they move into former French colonies in Southeast Asia, or British informal colonies in the Middle East, they sort of find themselves just leading sort of colonial lifestyles, as it were. They live in, as you say, these enclaves that have been built by previous generations of Westerners. They live in sort of colonial era mansions. They have colonial. They have household staff, just in much the same way that the previous Westerners in these places did. They sometimes inherit agents from locals who are going to assist them in gathering secrets from previous European, British, and French intelligence officers in these places. attitudes, kind of colonial era attitudes, or often, right, off. There are still European intelligence officers around, sort of trying to advise and influence them. So colonial era attitudes as well, I think, color the kind of intelligence that they're collecting. Yeah, even those who are quite sympathetic with the sort of nationalist values of the inhabitants of these former colonies, and don't want to and about and have a sort of different kind of methodological approach to intelligence gathering as well. Sort of the CIA favors this more kind of scientific approach over the sort of more cultural, intuitive one that the British had tended to adopt. Nonetheless, the sort of the shadow of earlier colonial empire is just looms over everything, and is impossible to escape for this generation.
A lot of the leaders of these anti-colonial movements, like Ho Chi Minh, they look to America almost as a guiding light. You know, the city on the hill. The Ho Chi Minh like thought that George Washington was like really awesome, for example. But then you're saying that during the period of the Cold War, then America gets enmeshed in these relationships, and it finds its sort of identity change as a result. Is that fair?
Yeah, yes, it is. I think that's you captured the dynamic really well there. That there is this interest in and admiration for America as the first anti-colonial nation, amongst independence leaders like Ho Chi Minh and others during World War II. That the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA, sort of immediate wartime predecessor, works with Ho Chi Minh and other nationalist leaders, in the case of Vietnam, to defeat the Japanese. So there is this kind of specific history of recent cooperation between American spies and nationalist leaders, and I think that's it's helpful to see that specific moment as well against the background of American missionary work in the colonial and, of course, what becomes the post-colonial world. The missionaries exercised a big influence over the CIA, because they were among some of the few U.S. citizens with extensive experience of living and working overseas, and there's quite an important missionary influence. I think you see it in figures like two U.S. Middle East hands, William Eddy and Stephen Penrose, who were in the OSS and then really helped set up the CIA in the 1940s. And there is, perhaps surprisingly, there's a lot of sympathy amongst that sort of group of missionary or missionary descended American spies and the nationalist values, the desire for independence of third world leaders like Ho Chi Minh. So I think there's this kind of under the radar sort of ideological kind of battle going on within the CIA between the types of people that we were talking about earlier, the sort of the kind of faux British imperialists, or almost, if you like. I guess the archetypal example being Alan Dulles, right, the CIA director during the 1950s, and the sort of desire for a kind of American imperial power and personal imperial adventure as well that they sort of represent, and then this other sort of subset within the agency, which is kind of eclipsed during the 1950s, of people who had this quite anti-colonial, actually often really quite anti-British in their attitudes. That there were CIA officers like that as well, or people who have been influenced by values like that. And increasingly, I think that impulse kind of loses out as the imperial one takes hold.
So I thought that would be interesting to start off with an example. So maybe we could talk about Kim Roosevelt. Tell us how he is situated within your book, and then tell us a little bit more about him, please.
Sure. I have a chapter sort of about Kim Roosevelt and in particular the coup that he commanded, the coup operation that he commanded in Iran in 1953, which is kind of the moment that he's best known for, the overthrow of the nationalist, anti-colonial prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, which is followed by the sort of restoration of the rule of the Shah. And Roosevelt was really, personally, I think, responsible for the success of that particular operation. But he's an interesting fellow because he's slightly torn between these impulses that I was just talking about. So his background was that he was very much, a leading member of the sort of the East Coast kind of the aristocratic element within the CIA, a grandson of Theodore Roosevelt and a product of Groton and Harvard. And he was nicknamed for Kipling's boy spy hero, Kim. His name was actually Kermit Roosevelt. He inherited that from his father, but he acquired this nickname because of his desire, I guess, for mischievous adventure in his youth, Kim, that stuck with him right into his adult years. So he's very much a sort of, I see him as a kind of an imperial adventurer in the sort of British imperial Kipling Buchan mold and tradition. But he served in Cairo, Egypt, with the OSS during the years of World War II, and he met a lot of kind of missionaries, stock Middle East hands there, and as a result of his dealings with them, became kind of surprisingly sympathetic with Arab nationalism, and indeed, at the same time that he's helping overthrow Mossadegh in Iran, he's actually bolstering the new Arab nationalist government of Gamal Nasser in Cairo that has just overthrown the British. So he seems to me to kind of really sort of personally kind of exemplify this tension that I'm talking about between the sort of the imperial and the missionary impulses. In his case, though, it's pretty clear that the sort of the imperial won over, and he sort of entered Iran in 1953, almost, I think, seeing himself as a romantic imperial adventure, like his the boy hero inspired his fictional nickname Kim.
I find the role that Groton School plays quite fascinating in this. Tell us a little bit more about that. The headmaster, when was the school set up? Why does this play such a particularly important role in this early phase of the CIA?
It's set up in the 1800s by a sort of New England blue blood, Endicott Peabody, who'd been educated in England at an English public school. Of course, they were confusingly known as public schools, even though they were private fee-paying ones.
He almost sounds like a Victorian general, doesn't
He
he?
does a little bit,
Endicott
yeah. And he
Peabody.
kind of, and in a sense, he was. I mean, he was headmaster of this school that he personally established after sort of absorbing British imperial values of sort of service and manhood, and you were supposed to perform heroically on the playing field. Perhaps if you were too smart, if you're academically kind of too successful, that was almost a candidate against you. Yeah. So he very much kind of reproduced this kind of this notion of British imperial manhood, and that was the sort of the kind of role model that his pupils were supposed to aspire to. And Theodore Roosevelt was, of course, the hero of the Spanish-American War, and as I'm sure I don't need to tell your listeners, this very important U.S. president in the early 20th century, Kermit Roosevelt's grandfather. He sends all of his sons there. Also in attendance are the sons of many other sort of eminent members of New England society, of the sort of East Coast aristocracy, including. I remember looking at a sort of Groton yearbook from the 1930s. It's almost like a sort of roll call of the early CIA. It's extraordinary how many other officers who go on to participate in operations like the 1953 Iran one attended Groton, and presumably sort of sitting at the feet of Endicott Peabody, absorbed the sorts of values that he represented.
Can you tell us the names of a few more of them, of the
Yes,
officers who?
I think I'm right in thinking that Richard Bissell is a Grotonian. Uh, Joe Alsop, who isn't actually a CIA officer, but nonetheless is a profoundly connected with the CIA. He's a journalist, very very influential, widely read one in the 1950s and 1960s. A cousin of Kermit Roosevelt, who also attended Groton, and there are others. I think Des Fitzgerald was there. I'm not absolutely certain, but
It's
I
okay.
remember being struck at the time how I kind of recognized one name after another. It was extraordinary.
So this leads to my next question. So the person who's seen as the established narrative that we spoke about earlier, in that narrative, the person who's seen as the kind of George Washington for modern American intelligence is Wild Bill Donovan, General Donovan. Um, but his background, upstate New York, Buffalo, Irish. It doesn't seem to be the most obvious person who's going to set up an agency that's going to have a flavour of British imperialism. If anything, it seems like the opposite. So just tell us how does I know that Donovan's not the first director of the CIA, but nevertheless, help me understand how we get from Wild Bill Donovan, Irish ancestry, pull himself up by the bootstraps, Medal of Honor, World War One, and then all of a sudden we have this agency that's uh, got all of these British sensibilities and flavors and imperial impulses. It would seem to be kind of run counter to Donovan, or maybe you disagree.
No, I mean Donovan is clearly an important figure, right? He is personally responsible, I think, to a great extent for the creation of the OSS, and his influence is there during the late 1940s as the CIA is set up, but. He's kind of co-opted into. I mean, it's not the sort of the East Coast sort of imperial class that I talk about. It's like the kind of British establishment. Actually, it's quite good at sort of occasionally kind of co-opting people who aren't necessarily born into that class into its ranks because they're particularly smart or have particular talents and therefore can sort of help with its agenda. And of course, Donovan does. He's a Wall Street lawyer. In terms of his career, he spends most of his life amongst the sorts of kind of British imperial influenced East Coast aristocrats that I'm writing about, and his kind of influence does recede in the late 1940s. He's already quite elderly, and he eventually, I think, passes in the late 1950s. But he isn't sort of he doesn't exercise quite the personal influence on the creation of the CIA that, say, Alan Dulles does, and Dulles is very much, along with his brother John Foster, who is Secretary of State during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s. It is to say that it is Dulles and others like him, whom he kind of Dulles consciously recruited from the Ivy League schools to serve immediately under him in the CIA in the 1950s, who really, I think, kind of exercises the most important personal influence.
And with the example of Kim Roosevelt, it's easy to make the connection to the larger thesis of your book, and the title of the book. But somebody like Sherman Kent, for people that are listening that don't know who he is, could you just tell them who he is and also how he connects to the thesis of your book? Intelligence analysis. How does that end up becoming part of this imperial framework that you discuss?
Yes, Kent is he's born in California, so he isn't sort of born right in the middle of this kind of East Coast class that I write about, but he's very connected to it. He attends Yale, becomes he can trace his family ancestry back to the American Revolution. So he's kind of another sort of American aristocrat, despite his Californian background in the mold of the others I write about. And after Yale and service in the OSS, he is really the sort of founder of intelligence analysis. So now I'm talking not about the sort of the covert action side of the agency that Alan Dulles and Kim Roosevelt and others kind of carried through and represented, talking about it. The gathering and the analysis and the reporting of intelligence. Kent is seen not just as the sort of the most important figure in the history of CIA, that particular mission at the CIA, but I think sort of intelligence generally within the US. He's kind of like the sort of the great theoretician, if you like. He wrote influential books, and the sort of the intelligence training unit within the CIA that was created in around about 2000 was named for him, so his influence lasted. He seems to me another example of sort of how Americans were trying to do something different, and of course partly succeeded in doing so, but nonetheless ultimately succumbed to sort of earlier imperial influences, in the sense that he tried to sort of break away from this kind of British kind of cultural, almost even sort of literary influenced approach to intelligence. He tried to make it into a science, something very kind of quantifiable. He talks about how he disliked poets and wanted mathematicians to serve under him on the CIA Board of Estimates, sort of the top intelligence unit, right, that reported to the president. But he seems to me that when it came to the actual sort of mission that this first generation of CIA officers were trying to carry out on the ground in former colonies, that actual sort of scientific, kind of completely objective, neutral sort of intelligence finding and reporting was actually very difficult to achieve in practice. That it sort of gave way to the kinds of imperial influences that I've talked about. Just because these young men, they were men by and large, just because of the lives they were leading, it was hard not to kind of succumb to earlier models of intelligence gathering and analysis.
And I think that I remember coming across, a paper that he wrote on words for estimative probability. It's almost like words can be used as fractions or something like this.
Yes, that's
Or
right. Yes, you've got it. He wanted sort of degrees of estimative probability attached to particular words. He was always trying to get the intelligence estimates that he and his lieutenants in the CIA were writing to kind of have this kind of degree of linguistic precision, right? But I finished my chapter on Kent and the intelligence mission that he commanded by quoting from his personal memoirs, which are sort of, I think, Vanity published in his retirement. And it's very striking when he talks about some foreign tours of CIA stations overseas that he undertook in the 50s. He kind of writes, he relates these anecdotes, which, there's nothing scientific or objective about them. He uses really language that from a 21st century perspective looks pretty darn offensive when describing the peoples he's encountering, the local peoples that he's encountering in Asia and the Middle East. And he generally, the whole thing sort of has the air of a kind of Kipling-esque adventure. So it seems to me that even though he truly tried to sort of make these scientific objective values that he wrote about into the guiding principles of the CIA intelligence mission. Even personally, within his own kind of behavior and attitudes, actually, he was sort of beholden to more kind of cultural, imperial, emotional, right? Emotions actually were kind of a huge factor here, despite this kind of desire for scientific objectivity. The other factors were actually what were really influential, and including on Kent himself.
So let's talk about one more person in the book, and then if anybody wants to read about the rest of the people, they're going to have to buy it. I
Excellent
think he.
advice, Andrew.
But I think just from a slightly later time period, Edward Lansdale, another Californian, tell the listeners a little bit more about him and how he's folded into the imperial history of the CIA.
Sure. Yeah, Lansdale is very much not from the sort of class that Alan Dulles and Kermit Roosevelt and even despite his Californian upbringing, Sherman Kent all belong to. He grows up in the Depression in a fairly sort of poor. I think he's born in Detroit originally. His family moves around a lot, so he does not attend Groton. He ends up on the West Coast. He's kind of very. He's if Kermit Roosevelt is kind of it sort of looks and sounds posh. Lansdale is kind of much more sort of slangy, sort of populist in his approach. He works in the OSS and then in the Army, ultimately in the Air Force. By this point, I'm talking about the late 1940s. He's quite sort of irreverent. His commanding officers don't always care for him because he can be quite disrespectful in their eyes to him, and he tries to. He is very kind of much anti-colonial in his approach. He talks about how he loves foreigners, Asians in particular. He wants to be their brother, and that's those are the values that at least kind of superficially or to all outward appearances guide him when he goes to the Philippines in the late 1940s and then subsequently shifts to Vietnam in the 1950s, where he's trying to advise and strengthen pro-American anti-communist governments. So the chapter in which Lansdale features is really about regime maintenance as opposed to regime change, which is the other kind of, very broadly speaking, covert action mission of the CIA, one represented in my telling by Kermit Roosevelt. So Lansdale is very anti-colonial, not of the sort of Groton Ivy League class, but I go on in my chapter on him to sort of describe about how even Edward Lansdale, this populist, professed anti-imperialist, couldn't escape the shadow of the imperialist past. He too was sort of haunted by imperial ghosts.
And this is because of what we discussed earlier, just the fact that America inherited the position of the superpower after World War II. So therefore, just inherits these structures that are hundreds of years old.
That's right.
Most of human history is the history of empires, for better or for worse. So there's no escaping it. But
yes,
what happens.
That is, I think, just what happens with Lansdale. He's trying to do something different. He's very informal. He goes into Filipino villages and sort of befriends the locals. He's plays the harmonica, shows the kids Disney movies, this sort of thing. Yeah. I think back of it, when the winning of hearts and minds by sort of soft cultural diplomacy like that doesn't work. In fact, Lansdale reaches for more coercive measures. In the language of counterinsurgency, he goes from population centric to enemy centric tactics, and he even advocates the
What does
use
that look like?
that. Well, in the case of the Philippines, it means going after the Hukbalahaps, who are the communist insurgents that the US is trying to defeat with napalm and using the kind of the most sort of brutal forms of modern warfare available. And it seems to me, in terms of Lansdale's operations in the Philippines, there are echoes of the earlier US occupation of that country that followed the Spanish-American War. So, Lansdale is kind of haunted by America's imperial past as well as the European one. I mean, it's a formal imperialism, of course, that America has much less of a history of that than the European powers, but it has some, and it seems to me, those deep structures, as you put it, I think very well, sort of are still in play in the Philippines in the 40s and 50s when Lansdale is there, and then possibly even more so in Vietnam when Lansdale is shifted there in 1954 as an undercover CIA officer, but by this point to try and strengthen Ngo Dinh Diem, the pro-American South Vietnamese leader. A mission that ultimately fails, leading to Diem's assassination in '63, and then the escalation of the Vietnam War that follows.
And just in case any listeners, they're thinking, goodness sake, Hammond, you're asleep at the wheel here. You need to push back a little bit on empire and imperialism. I mean, okay, so America comes along. Its strategic trajectory means that it gets inserted into a world of the decline of empires. So it inherits these deep structures that are hundreds of years old. But, some people listening would say, come on, that's not exactly the same as like the British and the French. I mean, there's countless examples where America just left a country willingly, whereas the goal of the British and the French would be to occupy it and then control it for their benefit. So, we can think of Japan and Germany. We can think of Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, there's no huge constituency here for keeping imperial outposts in Afghanistan or Iraq. Is actually, most people are glad that America's out of those countries. So, there must be something qualitatively different about the United States. So, is it fair to say that is it fair to call the history of the CIA imperial?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to I mean that in sort of two ways. One is that somewhat against its own will. I mean, the CIA doesn't always want these missions, these operations. The CIA is asked by successive U.S. administrations in the 1950s and 1960s to sort of, perform these interventions in foreign societies that oftentimes do, I'm afraid, resemble interventions by earlier colonial powers in the regions concerned. I think during the 1950s, because of decolonization, as we've discussed, there's particular pressure on the US to do these interventions on the quiet, covertly, which is, I think, why the CIA becomes such an important instrument of US power in the world. it's also, and yes, there is a more pronounced history, as we've also discussed, of anti-imperialism in the US than there is in, say, Britain or France. I certainly don't mean to deny that, and I show in the book how that even influences the early CIA. Particularly through these kind of missionary descended operatives who end up in it. But and again, I think this is partly why the CIA is so important, because to some extent these operations, these interventions have to be almost concealed from the US public as well as foreign populations. But I mean, we could have a sort of a day long argument about whether the US is an empire or not, which is why I kind of said at the beginning, I don't want to get too hung up on that question. But nonetheless, there are clearly continuities and inheritances. Yes, the US was less of a formal empire than, let's say, the British, but nonetheless, it has massive power in the world, which it does use to project, US interests overseas by and not just by military means, considerable though they are in terms of US bases and air power in particular, but also by economic means and cultural means and so on. It's also worth bearing in mind that although there is this contrast between formal and informal empire, just as there's earlier imperial interventions, such as those carried out by the British, they didn't face as much overseas and domestic opposition as that faced by the Americans, which is why they could resort to more overt measures, gunboat diplomacy, and so on. Nonetheless, that there are similarities, including the fact that the British didn't just run a formal empire; they also resorted, when circumstances demanded, to economic influence, to cultural influence, to sometimes to covert interventions, sort of palace coups of the sort that around 1953 was. The British got into India in the first place. Colonial India, the beginning of the Raj in the 1750s, was through the Battle of Plassey, which is kind of sold to the British public as this heroic imperial battle, was actually basically a palace coup of the sort that, to some extent, the Americans were carrying out much later. So without, I don't think you need to get too sort of bogged down in the whole question of America as an empire, except, is it identical to the British and French? Nonetheless, to see it, when you start looking, as I did, you do see these lines of continuity, these influences. It played out in the lives of these individuals, the sort I've just been describing, so that even both Kermit Roosevelt and Edward Lansdale, of all people, who in many of their conscious attitudes were anti-imperial, anti-colonial, nonetheless sort of found themselves repeating some of the patterns of the past.
You've written on the CIA for a number of years now, and you've got this excellent course which I have on Audible on the history of the CIA. So and in that you mention, I'm not American, as you can tell from my accent. So this just made me think, what do you think that being in some ways an outside observer uh, brings to the table in terms of looking at American intelligence? I think it's a very healthy thing, right? I mean, I wouldn't want only British people to write British history. I just think that that's going to be a distortion. I think there has to be a kind of more of a marketplace of different perspectives and so forth. But what do you think, being not an Englishman in New York, but an Englishman in LA, what does it offer you, or what have you learned about this country, or what kind of vantage point or perspective does that give you?
I think what you just said, really. I think having a slightly different vantage point, not entirely different, but a slightly different one is can be helpful. I don't know if it makes a crucial difference, but I think it helps. In my case, at least with my latest work, I think it probably makes me more inclined to, and situated in this bigger picture, right, to sort of slightly question some of the sort of the exceptionalist beliefs that people have, some scholars have had about U.S. foreign relations and bring a sort of knowledge of European empire and British history in particular to the table, and just look at the CIA from a slightly different angle. I mean, I don't have all the answers, and I know that an imperial approach will put some people off, possibly anger them, but nonetheless, I really think I show in my book how putting it in that kind of a framework does reveal some new things, including, I think, the roots of intelligence failure. The European colonial intelligence had failures as well. Think of the Indian, what used to be called the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Just that. I don't, as far as I'm aware, no U.S. intelligence historian has kind of, thought about, although there's a huge literature about what causes intelligence failures, because of course, these can have catastrophic consequences and we want to avoid them in future. But, putting them in that sort of wider framework, I think I'm not aware of anybody else having done that. And I just kind of put that out there, actually. I don't go into it in depth in my book, but I suggest perhaps, it might be useful to do that. And just finally, and answering that question, I mean, to some in terms of academic historians, right? There are a great many American journalists and also former practitioners and current practitioners, members of the the intelligence profession, have written about American intelligence, but precious few scholars do, except for European scholars. I mean, of course, there are some important exceptions. I could list them, but nonetheless, there is, and starting with a previous guest, I think, on your podcast, Roger Jeffries Jones, right, has written one of the sort of most widely regarded and respected histories of the CIA. Somebody needs to do it, because not many U.S. scholars are doing it, right? And I think there are various reasons for that, including the fact that it's hard to come by research funding, as I know from personal experience, for projects, probing the history of the CIA. It's something that funding agencies and a great many senior scholars, they don't want to go there in the US, but Brits have done, because they don't face quite those same constraints.
And final question, out of all of the characters in your book, which one would you like to have a drink with? There's some fascinating ones in there.
Question, yeah.
I mean, James Angleton would be fascinating, but I feel like they would all be fascinating for different reasons.
Sure. Well, I met one or two of the people I write about. Called Meyer, who's an important. He's the sort of figure I hang America, CIA sort of propaganda and psychological operations from. I met him and found him a rather dour personality. I shouldn't think a drink with him would be particularly entertaining. I suspect it would. And James Angleton, another important figure in the second half of the book about the sort of the domestic history of the CIA. I think many people found him kind of just quite weird on a personal basis. So I think it'd probably have to be Lansdale. Okay. He was famously a party animal. So I mean, it could get out of hand, and I'm not sure I could keep pace with him, but I suspect he'd be the most entertaining company with the most stories.
Well, thanks ever so much. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of SpyCast. Please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoy the show, please tell your friends and loved ones. Please also consider leaving us a 5-star review. If you have feedback, you can reach us by email at spycast@spymuseum.org or on X at INTL SpyCast. I'm your host, Andrew Hammond, and my podcast content partner is Erin Dietrich. The rest of the team involved in the show is Mike Mincey, Memphis Vaughan III, Emily Coletta, Emily Renz, Afu Anokwa, Ariel Samuel, Elliot Peltzman, Trey Hester, and Jen Ivan.